Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and today we're reviewing Star Trek Hell's Mirror, a one-shot comic put out by IDW this week that features the return of legendary writer J.M. DeMattis to Star Trek. So it's a pretty cool book, and the first one we'll be reviewing out of the new batch that I got out of This Week in Comics. Unlike last week, I have not experienced any tremendous delays and have all my books, which is great. And it'll be interesting to talk about some other stuff coming out this week as well. But as always, I kind of do these in random order, and this Star Trek book came out first. I picked up this and another sci-fi book of interest, and I think there will be a useful contrast to each other. But on the whole, I quite enjoyed this. We've never really talked about Star Trek on this channel before, but I'm a big fan of the Star Trek series. I have a couple of older Star Trek comics back when DeMattis used to write for this sort of thing. And I know a lot about the show and various other apocryphal materials and that sort of thing. So with Matthew Dow Smith doing some pretty good artwork and Candice Han doing the coloring, Neil Utaki doing the lettering, it's a strong book on the whole as a one-shot. I like the idea of it just kind of being this one-shot where they're just telling the simple story well contained within this comic book. Akbar, thanks for joining us. He is saying, I've never given Star Trek comics any attention since the DC TOS and movie comics of the late 80s and early 90s. I have stuff from even before that, I believe, that my sister just randomly got from a garage sale. And Akbar saying, I still have the DC Who's Who comics from back then. Curious to hear if this is good. Star Trek is life. Well, I'm going to start out spoiler free, and I might go a little more detailed in the spoiler free review than usual because it's kind of worth reading if you want to avoid all of that, because on the whole it's a pretty strong book. The art team as a group is able to create a pretty modern looking Star Trek comic with a lot of cool features. There's like some interesting battle scenes, a really well done ship little sequence that ends in a really striking panel that I think conveys the ferocity of space battles in ways that we don't often get, especially in the Trek shows. It all takes place in the Mirror universe, so you kind of need to know a little bit about Star Trek. This is not a good place to start, but I do think if you know a little bit about Star Trek and you know what the Mirror universe is, either from Discovery, DS9, the original series, or Enterprise, then you're fine. You don't even really have to know the specifics of the TOS version of the mini series, of the Mirror universe, I should say. But that's the one that's going to pay off the most, since it features Mirror Spock and Mirror Kirk. But the story is really about the Mirror universe version of Khan, Noonien, and Singh. Now, without getting into too much about the book, I will say this book very much reads kind of like the sort of one shot you might get out of like a DC tie-in where they're doing a bunch of little stories about villains. Back when they did Villains Month, for example. This is like the Khan book of that era, like where you could get something like from Riddler or Black Adam or any number of villains, and it would just be a sort of little story, either telling their origins or just sort of this little self-contained thing. And this is more of that self-contained thing. We do go over Khan's origins and history in the Mirror universe, but it's interesting enough because it's not ground tread before. Oh, Akbar is saying who published it, can't see the imprint. Yeah, it's IDW. They, I believe, do most of the Trek stuff these days, and you always hear good things about IDW comics these days, and I think it's very much in line with that. This isn't the most important Trek story I've ever read. It's very self-contained and one-off, and it's not super Trekky in terms of it having some sort of political or philosophical point, although it has very Star Trek touches, uh, even for something taking place in the Mirror Universe, considering that the Mirror Universe is kind of like very true to its name. It's a inversion of Gene Roddenberry's big, grand, happy vision of the future. So things get very dark for the Terran Empire and its history across the Mirror universe. And this is all right in line with the continuity of that. What they do with Khan's character makes a lot of sense given the nature of the Mirror universe and does him justice. I'd say one of the best selling points of the art is it really conveys the actors and facial expressions quite well, given, this is all drawn, but it feels like Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner are adequately animated as they looked back in the day. And Ricardo Montalban, I believe it's this version of his Khan, looks great. And he has some really strong panels where it's conveying his facial expression. At one point, he kind of reels from something Spock says. And I just love the little look he gives of recognizing when he's kind of beaten in a little moment. Akbar is saying, "Here I am watching Voyager before I saw your tweet." I almost said Voyager, but I don't believe they've had a Mirror Universe episode. I could be wrong. That's because I think I listed all the series that have. And I really like the Mirror Universe. It's interesting because it sort of frees up the world of Trek a little bit to kind of explore darker themes that normally don't work in the main Trek universe and its established timeline. The some series such as Enterprise and even DS9, like some of their strongest episodes are these Mirror Universe episodes because they're so damn interesting. Akbar is saying no, they didn't. Yeah, I didn't think Voyager did. I don't believe TNG did, which is kind of interesting. Although they definitely had other alternate universe storylines, and I think that's it. Like Picard definitely didn't, but that would be too much after Discovery's whole thing. I think, and then that's a good example too. Discovery, I think that especially in their first season, that Mirror Universe stuff is the strongest that show's been to date, really, because season two. Woof. Akbar says only TOS, Enterprise, and DS9 did mirror episodes. Oh, okay. Well, for those that don't know, it's a bit of a thing in Discovery too, but that's like well over a year past, so I don't feel too bad about spoiling that. So on the whole, it's a pretty strong book. Now, I did talk just now about how much I like the artwork in certain regards. I talked about how strong it was in the space battle and how much I like it for facial expressions. I will say, and it's a little mixed because of this. On the one hand, the art kind of feels like a bit of a throwback to those classic Star Trek comics that Akbar and I were talking about earlier in this review. And the artwork lives up to that to a degree. It feels kind of like that sort of storytelling. And even though we're talking about the Mirror Universe and this story is pretty dark, it was a very warm and easy read because it just took me right back to the like it had a very nice and earned feeling of nostalgia to it because they really take you back to classic Star Trek storytelling and even the original series itself because we're drawing from that content obviously. It really feels like we're looking in at a story from the original series we haven't seen before, which is great. However, the art does a little things, and I think this also has to do with DeMattis and the way he kind of broke down the story across these pages, where certain beats of action really should have more weight to them than they do. For example, there's a panel where Kirk is grabbed by the neck and lifted in the air. And it's a very teeny tiny little panel on an otherwise much bigger page with a lot of other stuff going on. And it feels like that should be a little bit of a moment to show the situation Mirror Kirk is in at the moment and how he's kind of in over his head a bit. It also doesn't do a lot of sound effects. There are some, but you know how comics are with their little zappy noises and stuff like that, or whatever random action is being done through those captions. And those captions get made fun of sometimes, but you really don't know how important they can be for giving action like a certain sense of urgency and happening in panel and on page until they're missing. because a lot of phaser blasts aren't accompanied by any sound effects. A couple of characters are stabbed, and it's missing that, and they lose their weight and significance in that moment because of it. Um, I, I guess I'm dancing around it a little bit in terms of spoilers, but it just happens several times throughout this book, and it's an unfortunate aspect of the artwork because I feel like certain elements, if they had just thrown in a few more panels like that, would have had a bit more weight. It's not the end of the world, but it is a little disappointing. So, that's it for kind of a spoiler free review. I think you should check out this comic, like I said, if you know Star Trek, if you like the Mirror Universe, if you are at all into like DeMattis and his history with writing Trek in comics, then this is absolutely the book for you. And it's also just damn cool to be able to pick up a standalone Star Trek book and have a beginning, middle, and end for a pretty reasonable price. It's $4.99 cover, but it is pretty long. And the artwork does, like, I like the artwork on the whole. I had a criticism of it, and I think I tried to explain it as best I could at least, but it still felt very Star Trek, and I still very much enjoyed reading this book, and it felt like a proper space adventure that lives up to the name on the title. So, okay, let's go into what actually happens in the book, at least a little bit, because we open on Khan growing up on Earth, and like it resembles the story of Khan in the main universe, where he tried to like overthrow Earth and people rejected him, and his genetically enhanced counterparts, they were all, well, I guess they weren't imprisoned away, but in the Mirror Universe they rather left on their own to just sort of like go into suspended animation until maybe humanity advanced themselves or they could find a new home somewhere else. But, as those of you familiar with the Mirror Universe will know, the Terran Empire rose instead, and Khan talks about how humanity conquered like world after world, uh, like outlawed art, literature, poetry, and philosophy, broke down free will and free thought, and basically just created a massive intergalactic fascist dictatorship. So that's where we open, and then we learn that Khan. We kind of cut to Khan in some little ship, and he's talking to Spock, who is working with him. And Khan, through narration and the dialogue, it very kind of naturally blends the two in a way I quite like. Explains how he's been leading this rebellion, and he and only a handful of his genetically enhanced counterparts survived, but that was enough to take over a planet, and that planet sort of partnered with this group of rebels to form a bit of an army, and over time, he's taken a third of the empire. So this is sort of the setting and situation which we're arriving at the start of this story. We then cut to Kirk on on the USS Enterprise, engaged with some sort of vessel on behalf of Khan. It's pretty fun, seeing Mirror Universe Kirk in that classic villain vest, like Akbar was saying in chat there, and interacting with his crew and such, but pretty quickly, like it starts out very typical Mirror Universe. Kirk punches a dude, which does have a sound effect, and so it feels like a proper moment. Just for questioning his orders. He talks to one of Khan's genetically superior subordinates, and like I said, they play it straight at first, but all of a sudden, Kirk turns on his own crew and murders them all. So Sulu, Uhura, all that, like Chekhov, all of them are just dead. And he quickly talks to the Khan subordinate over comms, and just as security is arriving and attacking Kirk, he gets beamed aboard Khan's vessel, and it's revealed that he's like been secretly trying to defect with them as like seeking political asylum. And Kirk also reveals that he disabled the Enterprise's shields and also rigged all their photon torpedoes to explode. And the Enterprise goes up in smoke. And that's the page that we get like the little Star Trek Hellsmere title thing, along with the like credits of who made this comic. So it's a hell of an opening. Um, Hackwer says murders his bridge crew. How deliciously evil. Yeah, like it really nicely pulls off the ruthlessness of the Terran Empire. It's right in line with the stuff that's been set up with Mir Kirk before. And as we'll later see, Mir Spock is very much along those lines too. Khan ends up talking to Kirk. Everyone's very doubtful that Kirk, because he's like this star, infamous, like figure within the Empire and could potentially be the Emperor one day. So no one believes that he's just honestly defecting. But Khan attempts to do this Vulcan mind meld on him, explaining that Spock's been teaching him these things, and as someone who's genetically superior, he expects one day he'll master it far more than the Vulcans ever could. But for now, he's still learning and isn't able to break past Kirk's. How does Spock put it? Kirk's psyche is unusually vibrant, so Khan isn't able to break through. Spock instead does it, showing Khan images of Kirk's past, which is different, obviously, in the Mirror universe. Growing up in the Terran Empire, we learn that Mirror Kirk's family actually did read him books and did teach him about the world outside of the Empire and to question authority until their farm was burned down, they were all executed, and Kirk was taken in by the state. It gives us a pretty dark glimpse into what it's like growing up in the Terran Empire and the brainwashing, horrible trauma that the average citizen endures, which is something Khan talks about directly, and how he believes Kirk's a good model for the question of whether or not they can save the Terran Empire, but also just like save the people from this brainwashing and get them to understand of a world beyond it, because Khan believes that most of them have this glimmer in their childhood of humanity before it was stomped out. So they imprison Kirk, and Khan starts showing him books, which are a very precious commodity in the world of the Mirror universe, as these books are often just destroyed on sight. All digital record of them is completely erased. So really, it's just whatever physical copies people have smuggled around over the years. Khan, being this very powerful figure in the galaxy at this point, has quite the collection. So it doesn't take long for Kirk to open up a little bit, and pretty soon he's working with Khan. And they're talking, and you can kind of see Kirk open up a little bit about stuff. But they've also been talking about this Satori project, which Khan is certain will assure his victory against the Terran Empire, though he won't tell either Spock or Kirk anything about it, which I think is wise. And I will say right here at this point, I'm reading this and I'm thinking, okay, if I were Khan, I wouldn't trust any of these converts from the Terran Empire, because you're going to have some that are going to try and slip past, and you don't really know for sure, especially with Kirk, that they're on your side. So why give away your big weapon thing? Just let that be a secret amongst whatever insiders you can preserve, and especially knowing what a Satori project actually is, I think that would have been necessary. Because Khan makes the mistake of trusting both Kirk and Spock with this library, or I should say weapons location. Everyone thinks it's a weapon, but it turns out it's actually just a vast library. And I really like this plot point. I didn't, I kind of was hoping, we'll say, or thought it might be interesting if it was something like this, but it was really interesting and reassuring, we'll say, to see something like this. And Khan very much believes that Kirk was converted by the books and art and literature, and so could the rest of humanity. And they can kind of be won over from the Terran Empire. And he kind of treats it like a virus of ideas that can't be stomped out. I think it's a really interesting concept. But Khan... So going into this, I really thought, like, well, you can't trust Kirk, and I wouldn't even really trust Spock, because I could very much see both of those characters, especially knowing the Mirror universe and those versions of those characters, just betraying him. So he of course like, so he makes the mistake of showing it to them, and pretty soon they just start laughing because they're like, oh well, we thought this was some big weapon. We have dozens of ships in orbit, and they just start bombarding the whole thing. Khan gets stabbed in the back. That is one of those moments where it doesn't have any sort of sound to it, which I really feel underplays it because it's just Khan's sudden and momentous fall. And pretty soon the whole library starts getting bombarded. Kirk and Spock get beamed out, and they have won the day against Khan Noonien Singh, who is just crushed under the rubble. Later, Kirk and Spock talk a little bit. Spock mentions how their original plan of implanting false memories into Kirk and showing them to Khan didn't work, and the memories Spock saw were Kirk's actual memories of his childhood. And Kirk just basically tells him to F off. And like, it's true. That's definitely what happened. But Kirk doesn't want to, like, Mirror Kirk definitely doesn't want to talk about it. And, like, just sort of chews out Spock and threatens him if, like, he wants to pursue the matter any further. But after Spock leaves, Kirk does quietly pull out a book, a forbidden little item. And we reflect on one last thought from Khan on hope. So, it's not a huge story, very standalone, self-contained, just sort of side thing, but I really like it. I think this take on a mirror version of Khan is quite well done because in some ways he is a hero, which reflects like him being a literal opposite of his heroic version, but also where the main universe Khan waged war and death. This version of Khan was perfectly capable of such things, but really his ambitions were surrounded around teaching people and wanting to liberate them. And though clearly he still had old aspects of Khan's personality intact, and that's what I was saying much earlier about like this comic really does his character justice. Like he still is very much this powerful dude that amasses this huge force, and both Kirk and Spock kind of correctly point out that he is seeking his own power as much as he says he's trying to liberate people. But I do think this version of Khan's heart is in the right place. But as well established from the original series, Mirror Kirk and Mirror Spock are not good people. So, of course, they just turned on him and decimated him, which I also think is an interesting plot point, because just like in the regular universe, even though they're on opposite sides of the fence now, Mirror Kahn was just decimated by Mirror Kirk. The little touches work quite well for me, even if the big twist of of Kirk and Spock betraying Khan, I saw a mile away, and I would expect most people would too. Akbar was saying, sounds very in line with Star Trek style and philosophy, but turned on its head per the Mirror Universe. Interesting. Yeah, I think it was, on the whole, a very successful book, and a solid recommendation from me. It's also just an excellent, excellent start to a new week of comics. I was quite surprised, well, not surprised, I was quite pleased with how much I enjoyed this. I was optimistic about it, but I don't think I expected to enjoy it as much as I did. Those little qualms about the artwork and stuff like that aside, it's a fun little book. And I hope I've made clear it's not going to be like this huge long story or anything super significant. Like that main plot twist is very clear to me. Maybe if you haven't seen those original series episodes about the Mirror Universe, the turn won't be as obvious, but it also doesn't matter. I don't think that's a central issue. Like Akbar was saying, Star Trek style and philosophy is more on display here, and that really comes down to the library, which is a twist I didn't see coming as much, and I think is the more elegant part of this story, that Khan's character is not the same one as he is in the Mirror Universe, and probably would have ultimately led the human race in a better direction than the Terran Empire, which we kind of know a little bit of context surrounding, given how DS9 went to the Mirror Universe and showed us what it'll be like in hundreds of years from now. So that's all it's all pretty cool. I like Star Trek on the whole, and maybe we can find ways to talk about them a little bit more in the future. This particular video might be a little bit of a benchmark test for that to see how much of you guys are interested in Star Trek and what kind of future that franchise might hold here on the channel, because I can talk a lot about Star Trek, and there's a lot going on in the world of Star Trek these days. Akbar is saying, I'll get it digitally and see if my non-comic but full Trekkie brother is interested. Thank you for the review and recap. I enjoyed it. Well, you're welcome, Akbar. Thanks for joining me in chat along with our more silent viewers that have kind of come and gone as we've been talking. I feel like, and I was saying earlier, I don't know about this being a great book for new fans. I think you really need a sense of the Mirror Universe to fully appreciate it. But like I said, I think this is a solid book for casual fans. Because even if you know, just like if you've seen one episode with the Mirror Universe, I think you're set to enjoy this. Like let's say one episode about the Mirror Universe, and you kind of have to know a little bit about Khan. So that and Wrath of Khan, but that's a great movie that any old person could enjoy. So it's a solid addition to any Trek fans collection, that's for sure. And we'll leave it at that. So thanks for watching, guys. Next up, our old friend DC's Dead Planet is back in town, and I'm sure there's some horror show in store for us as we talk about that at some point in the future here on Comic Island. Thanks again, guys. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.